Venezuela and the global geography of oil. Oil, often referred to as black gold, is one of the most crucial resources in our modern world. Understanding its geography can help us grasp its impact on economies, politics, and our environment. This introduction will explore where oil is found, how it is extracted, and its significance on a global scale. Oil is a natural fossil fuel formed from the remains of ancient marine organisms. Over millions of years, heat and pressure transformed these remains into crude oil, which can be refined into gasoline, diesel, and various other products we use every day. Oil is not evenly distributed across the planet. The major oil reserves are concentrated in specific regions, including the Middle East. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran have some of the largest oil reserves in the world. North America, the United States, and Canada possess significant oil resources, especially in regions like Texas and Alberta. Russia, this country holds vast oil reserves and is one of the top producers globally. And other regions, countries in Africa, South America, and Asia also have smaller yet vital oil deposits. Venezuela has the largest deposits of oil, but relatively minor production. Understanding these geographical hotspots is essential, as they often influence global politics and economics. How is oil extracted? Oil extraction can be categorized into several methods. Conventional drilling, this traditional method involves drilling into the ground to reach oil reservoirs. Unconventional techniques like hydraulic fracturing or fracking and oil sands extraction are becoming more common as companies seek oil in areas previously considered inaccessible. Each method has its geographical implications as it affects the environment and requires specific geological conditions. Why is oil important? Oil is a driving force behind the global economy. It fuels transportation, powers industries, and is a key ingredient in countless products. The demand for oil also leads to geopolitical tensions as countries vie for access to these valuable resources. Understanding the geography of oil helps us recognize its impact on our world. As we study oil's origins, extraction methods, and geopolitical significance, we can better appreciate both its benefits and challenges. As we move into a future that increasingly focuses on sustainable energy, the role of oil in our lives remains a critical topic of discussion. Venezuela. Recent events in Venezuela have focused the world's attention on that country and the possible role that oil reserves play in the decision of the USA to intervene so dramatically. When people think about oil-rich nations, their minds often turn to places like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or Kuwait. However, it might surprise you to know that Venezuela actually holds the largest proved oil reserves in the world. The term proved reserves refers to deposits of oil that are known to exist and can be extracted economically using current technology and under present market conditions. This is important because not all oil underground is counted, only what can realistically be extracted at a profit today. According to the Energy Institute's statistical review of world energy, Venezuela's proved oil reserves are immense, roughly equal to those of Iran and Iraq combined, and more than 4 times those of the United States. These reserves are measured in billions of barrels and represent an extraordinary potential source of energy and income. Of course, estimates of reserves can change as new deposits are discovered, as technology improves, or as global oil prices shift, making some resources more or less economic to extract. This makes Venezuela a vital player in the global geography of energy resources. On paper, it should be one of the wealthiest oil nations on Earth, given its sheer geological endowment. Yet, as we'll see, the story is far more complicated. Despite possessing these colossal reserves, Venezuela produces relatively little oil. In other words, it is not using its assets efficiently. When comparing output among the top reserve-holding countries, Venezuela ranks at the bottom. It produces less than 5% of the amount of oil produced by the U.S., even though it has much larger reserves. Production levels depend on many factors beyond the size of reserves. Efficient extraction requires ongoing investment in technology, infrastructure like pipelines and refineries, and skilled labor, all of which have been limited in Venezuela for years. Additionally, political instability, economic sanctions from countries such as the U.S., and chronic mismanagement of the state oil company, PDVSA, have all constrained output. This mismatch between enormous reserves and low production highlights one of Venezuela's central economic challenges. It is rich in resources, but poor in capacity to turn them into economic gains. The reserves-to-production ratio, often shortened to RP ratio, is a useful concept in energy studies. It measures how long a nation's existing proved reserves would last if it continued producing oil at the current rate and no new reserves were added. The calculation is simple. RP equals proved reserves times annual production. Venezuela's RP ratio is extraordinarily high, well over 1,500 years in 2020. That means if production stayed constant, its known reserves could theoretically last for more than a millennium. By contrast, the U.S. has an RP ratio of about 11 years, indicating a much faster turnover of its reserves due to high output. However, it's important to note that this figure doesn't mean Venezuela will actually have oil for 1,500 years. Both reserve estimates and production rates fluctuate constantly. If Venezuela doubled its output, the RP ratio would immediately halve. The key takeaway is that Venezuela's production is so low compared to its resource base that its reserves could, in theory, last far longer than most other nations, but only because it's barely producing. Venezuela was once a major oil producer, with production levels more than 3 times higher in the 1970s, late 1990s, and early 2000s than they are today. Its oil industry was long dominated by PDVSA, the state-owned oil company, which also operated in partnership with foreign firms, such as Chevron. PDVSA typically held at least a 60% stake in these ventures, giving the government significant control over production and revenue. Since about 2014, Venezuela's oil output has collapsed. A combination of low global oil prices, underinvestment in infrastructure, and economic sanctions from countries such as the U.S. severely damaged its production capacity. Much of the decline has occurred during the presidency of Nicolás Maduro, who assumed power in 2013. Corruption, lack of technical maintenance, and the loss of skilled engineers have all contributed to the breakdown of oil fields and refineries. At the same time, economic isolation has made it hard for Venezuela to access foreign finance or technology to rebuild. In contrast, the United States, once a major importer of oil, has increased production dramatically over the past decade, particularly through the shale oil revolution. While Venezuela's production fell, the U.S. maintained or even set record highs, showcasing how technological and market conditions can transform national fortunes in energy. Light and heavy oil, and why that matters. Not all oil is the same. It varies in its density and viscosity, leading to classifications such as light oil and heavy crude. Light oil flows easily and is cheaper to refine, while heavy oil is thicker and more difficult and expensive to process. Venezuela's oil is mainly heavy crude, which poses technical challenges. The United States, on the other hand, produces mostly light crude, especially after the shale boom. However, many American refineries were originally built to process heavier types of oil, especially those imported from countries like Canada, Mexico, and Venezuela. Modifying these refineries to handle lighter oil would require huge investments, so the U.S. continues to import heavy crude while exporting lighter petroleum products. This creates an unusual trade pattern. The U.S. both exports and imports oil, but of different types. Venezuela's heavy oil could, in theory, fill a useful gap in the American refining system, which explains why the two countries have had a long, though currently strained, oil relationship. Venezuela's paradox. Venezuela is a classic example of the resource paradox. It possesses the largest oil reserves in the world, yet struggles to convert this into economic power or production. Several factors explain this contradiction: chronic underinvestment in oil infrastructure, government mismanagement and corruption, political instability and international sanctions, a reliance on heavy crude, which is more expensive to extract and refine. In theory, Venezuela could regain its former production levels within a decade if substantial investment, modern technology, and political reform were introduced. However, such changes are uncertain. Meanwhile, much of its heavy oil remains untapped underground. From a sustainability perspective, global climate goals mean that most of these reserves might never be exploited. Even if Venezuela could produce far more oil, doing so would conflict with efforts to limit global warming. So while Venezuela sits atop a treasure trove of energy potential, its economic and environmental future remains deeply complex. Regime change? Changing a country's government from the outside is more than just a political choice. It can create major economic challenges. Research on historical cases of foreign-imposed regime change shows that it often leads to lower economic growth or higher poverty in the affected country, little or no improvement in democratic institutions, and sometimes a decline, weaker government structures, and increased instability. This does not mean that the original government was always effective or fair. However, studies indicate that attempts to overthrow governments from the outside are more likely to harm a country's economy and institutions in the long run than to improve them. Economics can help explain the potential costs and benefits of different policies, even if it does not decide what is morally right. One key trade-off is that pursuing regime change might achieve immediate political aims, but it can create lasting economic difficulties, often affecting ordinary citizens. Thank you for listening to this Geography Expert podcast. You can find access to all my free resources through my website, www.richiecunningham.com, including links to my Geography Expert Substack and podcasts.